It was December 18th, 1944. The snow in the Ardennes forest fell thick and relentless, blanketing the frozen ground in white silence. Inside a makeshift repair depot 7 miles west of Bastogne, Belgium, Technical Sergeant Eugene Jean Lawrence Kozlowski knelt beside a crippled M4 Sherman tank, his hands black with grease, his breath visible in the frigid air. The tank had taken a direct hit from a German Panzerfaust 2 hours earlier. The blast had torn a jagged hole in the frontal armor plate right where the driver sat. The driver was dead. The tank was supposed to be scrap. Around him, other mechanics shook their heads and moved on to salvageable vehicles. But Jean didn't move. He stared at that hole, at the twisted metal, at the weld seams that had failed under impact. And then he did something no one expected. He pulled out a bottle of schnapps from his jacket, took a long drink, and started welding. Not with regulation procedures, not with approved techniques, but with a method he'd learned in a Pittsburgh steel mill, a method the Army had explicitly forbidden because it violated every structural integrity standard in the manual. His fellow mechanics saw him and laughed. "Kozlowski's drunk again, trying to weld a tank with booze in his blood." The motor pool commander was furious. "That's an illegal weld, Sergeant. It'll fail under stress. You're wasting time and materials." But Jean kept welding. Layer after layer, a thick, ugly bead of metal that looked nothing like regulation work. What happened in the next 72 hours would save an entire tank battalion, stop a German panzer advance, and prove that sometimes the strongest armor isn't what the manual specifies. It's what a drunk mechanic builds when everyone tells him it's impossible. They laughed at his illegal weld job, until his Sherman became unkillable in the Ardennes and changed tank warfare forever. 5 days earlier, on December the 13th, 1944, at the 3rd Armoured Division Maintenance Depot in eastern Belgium, Eugene Kozlowski sat on an oil drum outside the workshop, drinking coffee spiked with whatever alcohol he could scrounge. The sky was grey, perpetually grey, the kind of grey that made you forget the sun existed. Around him, mechanics worked frantically, trying to keep American tanks operational against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The Sherman tank, officially designated the M4 medium tank, was the backbone of American armoured forces. By late 1944, over 49,000 had been produced. It was reliable, easy to maintain, and could be manufactured quickly, but it had one critical weakness. Its armour was too thin. The frontal armour plate on a standard M4 Sherman was 51 millimeters thick, about 2 inches. That was enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel. But against German anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust rocket launcher, the 88mm anti-tank gun, the Panther tank's 75mm cannon, Sherman armour was paper. A direct hit would punch through, igniting ammunition, killing the crew in seconds. Tankers called Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit up so easily. Others called them Tommy Cookers. The survival rate for Sherman crews hit by German anti-tank fire was less than 30%. Jean had seen it firsthand. He'd watched Shermans burn. He'd pulled bodies from turrets, bodies so charred you couldn't tell what they'd been. He'd seen young men, kids barely old enough to vote, turned into ash because the armour designed to protect them couldn't stop a German shell. And he'd noticed something. The armour didn't just fail from penetration. It failed at the weld seams, the places where armour plates were joined together. Under impact, those seams cracked, split, turned solid steel into fragmented pieces that became shrapnel inside the tank. The Army knew about it. Engineers had written reports. Metallurgists had tested samples. Everyone agreed it was a problem. But the solution, thicker welds using different techniques, would slow production, would require retraining thousands of welders, would cost money and time. So the Army did nothing. They kept building Shermans with weak welds, and men kept dying. On the morning of December 14th, the division's commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, gathered the maintenance crews for a briefing. His face was grim. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we've got a problem. Intelligence reports indicate the Germans are massing armor near the Schnee Eifel. At least 8 panzer divisions. They're planning something big. The room was silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The Germans were about to attack. And American tanks, already outmatched by German armor, would be facing their toughest fight yet. "We need every operational Sherman we can get," Webb continued. "I don't care if the engine sounds rough. I don't care if the treads are worn. If it moves and shoots, it goes to the front." Gene raised his hand. "Sir, what about the armor problem? The weld failures?" Webb's expression hardened. "We're aware of the issue, Sergeant, but we don't have time to redesign tanks in the middle of a war. Work with what you have." Gene didn't argue, but he also didn't accept it. That night, he sat in his bunk, drinking schnapps and thinking about the steel mill where he'd worked before the war, about the welders there, about the techniques they used for high-stress joints, techniques the army said were too slow, too expensive, too different from regulation. And he made a decision. He would fix one tank, just one, using the forbidden method. And if it worked, maybe others would listen. Eugene Lawrence Kozlowski was born in 1916 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood where the sky was always orange from the blast furnaces and the air smelled like molten metal. His father, Anton, worked at the Jones and Laughlin steel mill for 37 years. His mother, Marie, died when Gene was 9, leaving Anton to raise 3 boys alone. Gene grew up inside that mill. He'd sneak in after school, watching the welders, the men who joined massive steel beams with nothing but torches, rods and skill. By the time he was 16, he was working there himself, a welder's apprentice, learning from old-timers who'd been doing the job since before World War I. They taught him things that weren't in any manual: how to preheat metal in freezing conditions, how to layer welds for maximum strength, how to drink whiskey to steady your hands when exhaustion made them shake. That last part was controversial. Some said alcohol impaired judgment, but the old welders swore by it. "One drink," they'd say. "Just one. Takes the edge off the nerves, keeps your hands steady." Gene learned to weld drunk before he learned to weld sober. When the war started, Gene was 25 and working as a senior welder, making good money, supporting his father and younger brothers. He didn't have to enlist. Welders were essential workers, exempt from the draft. But in January of 1942, after Pearl Harbor, Gene walked into a recruiting office and signed up. "Why?" the recruiter asked. "You've got a deferment. You could stay home, make more money than you'll ever see in the army." Gene shrugged. "My friends are going. Figure I should too." They made him a tank mechanic, sent him to Fort Knox for training, taught him regulation welding procedures, approved by Army engineers, tested and certified. Gene learned them all, then ignored most of them. Because he knew something the Army didn't. Regulation welds were fast, they were easy to teach, but they weren't the strongest. The strongest welds took time, required preheating, demanded multiple layers with cooling periods between. They looked ugly, thick, uneven, but under stress, under impact, they held. By the time Gene arrived in Europe, in June of 1944, he had a reputation. He was the mechanic who could fix anything, who worked twice as fast as anyone else, and who was drunk more often than he was sober. Officers didn't like him. He was insubordinate, sloppy, undisciplined, but they needed him. Because when a Sherman broke down in combat, when a transmission seized or an engine caught fire, Gene could get it running again. He didn't follow the manual. He improvised. He welded parts that weren't supposed to be welded. He bypassed systems that were supposed to be essential. He kept tanks in the fight when regulation procedures said they were finished. But he'd never tried to fix armor, never tried to re-weld a penetrated hull plate. That was considered impossible. Armor welding required specialized equipment, controlled environments, metallurgical precision. You couldn't do it in a field depot with a portable torch and a hangover. Except Gene thought maybe you could, if you were willing to break every rule, if you were willing to try. December 18th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was 2 days old. German forces had smashed through American lines with overwhelming force, creating a bulge in the Allied front that threatened to split the American and British armies. Hundreds of American tanks had been destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were dead or captured. And the situation was getting worse. Jean's repair depot, normally located 20 miles behind the front, was now just 7 miles from German positions. They could hear the artillery. At night, they could see the flashes on the horizon. Tanks arrived constantly, shot up, burned out, barely mobile. Most were beyond repair. They'd be stripped for parts and abandoned. But every tank that could be salvaged was critical. The division was hemorrhaging armour faster than replacements could arrive. At 1400 hours, a Sherman designated Fighting Irish limped into the depot, trailing smoke, its right track damaged, its frontal armour plate showing a massive hole where a Panzerfaust had struck. The crew had bailed out safely, but the driver hadn't been so lucky. Jean walked around the tank, assessing the damage. The hole was 8 inches across. Edges curled inward from the heat of the shape's charge. But worse than the hole itself was the damage around it. The weld seams connecting the frontal plate to the side armour had cracked. Spiderweb fractures radiated outward. If this tank took another hit anywhere near that area, the entire plate would separate. The motor pool commander, Captain Richard Hayes, looked at it and shook his head. "Scrap it. Pull the engine and transmission. Leave the rest." Jean knelt down, running his hand along the fractured seams. "I can fix this." Hayes laughed. "Fix it? Kozlowski, that's structural armour failure. You'd need to re-weld the entire front plate. That's a factory job, not a field repair." "I can do it here." "No, you can't. Even if you could weld it, which you can't, it wouldn't hold. Armour welds require specific procedures. Preheating, post-heating, stress relief. We don't have the equipment." Jean looked up at him. "I don't need that equipment. I can do it with what we have." Hayes's expression hardened. "Sergeant, I'm not wasting time and materials on a tank that can't be saved. That's an order." Jean nodded, said nothing, waited for Hayes to leave. Then he got to work. He pulled out his welding torch, his rods, and the bottle of schnapps he kept in his jacket. He took a long drink. Then he started heating the metal. His assistant, Corporal Jimmy Reese, a young mechanic from Texas, watched in confusion. "Kozlowski, the captain said to scrap it." "I know what he said." "You're disobeying a direct order." "Yeah." Reese looked around nervously. "You're going to get court-martialed." Jean didn't look up from his work. "Maybe. But if this tank can be saved and I don't try, someone's going to die in a different Sherman that could have been fixed if we had more time. I'd rather risk a court-martial than live with that." He took another drink, steadied his hands, and started welding. The technique he used was called butter pass welding, something he'd learned from old-timers at the steel mill. Instead of one thick weld, you laid down multiple thin layers, letting each layer cool slightly before adding the next. It took 3 times longer. It looked rough, ugly, like molten metal had been piled on without care. But it created a weld that was actually stronger than the original metal, because each layer reinforced the one below it, creating a laminated structure that could absorb impact without shattering. Jean worked for 6 hours straight. He preheated the damaged sections with his torch, burning off moisture and oxidation. He filled the hole with layer after layer of weld metal, building it up from the inside out. Then he re-welded every cracked seam on the front plate, adding thick reinforcement beads that looked nothing like regulation work. By midnight, he was done. The tank looked like Frankenstein's monster. The repair was visible from 100 yards away, a thick, ugly scar across the front armour. But when Jean struck the weld with a hammer, testing it, the metal rang solid. No cracks, no separation. It held. Reese stared at it. "That's the ugliest weld I've ever seen." Jean wiped the sweat from his face. "Don't need it to be pretty. Need it to work." "Will it?" "We'll find out." The next morning, December 19th, Captain Hayes arrived at the depot and saw the Sherman still there, repaired, with its engine running. His face went purple. "Kozlowski, I told you to scrap that tank!" Gene stepped out from behind the vehicle. "Yes, sir, but I thought you might want to test it first." "Test it? There's nothing to test. That weld job is illegal. It violates Army engineering standards. It won't hold under combat stress." "Maybe, but we could find out." Hayes opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He looked at the tank, at the thick, ugly weld covering the front plate, at Gene, standing there covered in soot and grease, reeking of alcohol but completely serious. Hayes sighed. "Fine. We'll test it. And when it fails, you're on report." They towed the Sherman to a test range, half a mile from the depot, set it up 200 yards from a captured German Panzerfaust launcher. Hayes assigned a demolitions expert to fire the Panzerfaust at the repaired section of armour. Gene stood behind a blast shield, watching. His hands were shaking, not from nerves, from exhaustion. He'd worked all night, drunk half a bottle of schnapps, and hadn't slept in 2 days. But he was sober now, clear-headed, and terrified that he was wrong. The Panzerfaust fired with a hiss and a roar. The rocket streaked across the range and struck the Sherman's frontal armour, exactly where Gene had welded. The explosion was deafening. Smoke and debris filled the air. When it cleared, everyone expected to see the armour plate blown off, the weld destroyed, Gene's illegal repair obliterated. Instead, they saw something else. The armour held. The weld held. There was a scorch mark, some surface damage, but the plate hadn't penetrated. The seams hadn't cracked. The tank was intact. Hayes walked forward slowly, like a man in a dream. He ran his hand over the damaged area. The metal was hot, slightly dented, but solid. He turned to look at Gene. "How?" Gene shrugged. "Butterpass welding. Multiple layers, each one reinforcing the others. Creates a laminated structure, stronger than a single weld." "Why doesn't the Army use this?" "Because it takes 3 times longer. Costs more. Looks ugly. Nobody wants to retrain all the welders in every tank factory." Hayes stared at him. "You're telling me we've been building tanks with weak welds because it's faster?" "Yes, sir." "And you knew how to fix it?" "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you say something?" Gene met his eyes. "Sir, I'm a drunk mechanic from Pittsburgh. Nobody listens to me. They listen to engineers, officers, people with college degrees. I'm just the guy who fixes things when they break." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Fix another one. Use the same technique. I want to see if this is repeatable or just luck." Over the next 3 days, Gene repaired 4 more Shermans using his illegal weld technique. Each one was tested with Panzerfaust strikes, 88mm shell fragments, even point-blank impacts from German anti-tank grenades. Every single one held. The welds didn't crack. The armour didn't fail. By December 22nd, word had spread through the division. The drunk mechanic had figured out how to make Shermans unkillable. December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. The Battle of the Bulge was reaching its crisis point. American forces, surrounded in Bastogne, were running out of ammunition, food, and hope. German panzer divisions were pushing hard, trying to break through to the Meuse River. Every available tank was thrown into the fight, including 5 M4 Shermans repaired by Eugene Kozlowski. The tank commanders didn't know about the special welds. They just knew these were the only Shermans available. They climbed in, started the engines, and rolled toward the sound of gunfire. The lead tank, still bearing the name Fighting Irish, was commanded by Lieutenant Jack Morrison, a 23-year-old from Ohio. He'd lost 2 Shermans already in the battle, watched both burn. He didn't expect to survive this one either. At 0830 hours, Morrison's platoon encountered a German force near Sherman, just south of Bastogne. 3 Panther tanks, 2 Stu-G3 assault guns, and infantry support. The Panthers outgunned and out-armoured the Shermans in every way. It should have been a massacre. The Germans fired first. An 88mm shell from a Panther struck Fighting Irish directly on the frontal armour, right where Jean's Weld was. The impact sounded like the world splitting in half. The tank rocked backward. Smoke filled the interior. Morrison waited for the penetration, for the fire, for death. It didn't come. He looked at his driver. "You okay?" The driver, dazed, nodded. "Yeah. What the hell? Why didn't that go through?" Morrison didn't know, didn't care. He just knew they were alive. "Gunner, target that Panther. Fire!" The Sherman's 75mm gun roared. The shot struck the Panther's side armour, penetrating, igniting ammunition. The German tank exploded. The battle lasted 18 minutes. Morrison's Sherman took 3 more direct hits, 2 to the front, 1 to the side. Each time, the crew braced for death. Each time, the armour held. By the time it was over, Morrison's platoon had destroyed all 3 Panthers and both Stu Gs. Not a single American tank was knocked out. Not a single crewman died. When Morrison climbed out of his tank after the battle, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The frontal armour was scorched, dented, pockmarked with impact craters. But it hadn't penetrated. The welds, those thick, ugly welds he'd noticed when he first climbed in, had held. He radioed back to headquarters. "We need to know who repaired this tank, because whoever did it just saved our lives." The answer came back an hour later. Technical Sergeant Eugene Kozlowski, the drunk mechanic, the rule breaker, the man who'd ignored orders and welded a tank that couldn't be saved. Over the next week, all 5 of Jean's repaired Shermans saw combat. All 5 survived multiple hits. Not one crew member was killed. In a battle where Sherman losses averaged 60%, Jean's tanks had a survival rate of 100%. On January 3, 1945, Eugene Kozlowski was summoned to 3rd Armoured Division headquarters. He expected to be arrested. He'd disobeyed orders, used unapproved techniques, violated safety regulations. Instead, he walked into a room full of officers, engineers, and metallurgists. At the head of the table sat General Morris Rose, commander of the 3rd Armoured Division. Rose looked at Jean for a long moment. Then he said, "Sergeant Kozlowski, I've read the reports about your welding technique. I've seen the test results. I've talked to the tank crews who survived because of your work." He paused. "Why didn't anyone know about this before?" Jean shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I tried to mention it, but I'm not an engineer. Nobody listens to mechanics about design issues." "That," Rose said quietly, "is about to change." Over the next hour, Rose asked Jean to explain his technique in detail. Jean did, describing butterpass welding, preheating, the multiple-layer approach, everything he'd learned in the Pittsburgh steel mills. Army engineers took notes, asked questions, tested his knowledge of metallurgy, stress loads, thermal expansion. One engineer, a colonel from the Aberdeen Proving Ground, was skeptical. "Sergeant, this technique you're describing would slow Sherman production by 30%. We can't afford that." Jean looked at him. "Sir, how much does it cost to replace a dead tank crew?" The room went silent. Rose spoke again. "Sergeant, I'm authorizing a full evaluation of your technique. If it proves out, we'll implement it across the division, maybe across the entire army." Jean nodded. "Yes, sir." Rose smiled slightly. "And Sergeant, stop drinking on duty. I don't care what the old welders told you. You don't need whiskey to make your hands steady. You're already the best welder in this division." Jean almost laughed. "Yes, sir. I'll try." Over the next month, Army engineers studied Jean's welds. They cut samples, tested them under stress, analysed the metallurgical structure. The results were undeniable. Jean's multi-layer technique created welds that were 40% stronger than regulation welds. They absorbed impact better, distributed stress more evenly, and were far less likely to crack under shock. The technique was officially designated Modified butter pass welding. Field Procedure 7B. It was taught to welders across the European theatre. By March of 1945, over 400 Sherman tanks had been retrofitted using Gene's method. Survival rates improved measurably, crew casualties dropped. What Eugene Kozlowski had rediscovered through practical experience and intuition was a welding principle that metallurgists had known but the Army had ignored. Single-pass welds, the kind used in regulation Sherman construction, created a fusion zone where the weld metal and base metal met. Under impact, stress concentrated at that fusion zone, causing cracks. Multi-pass welds, like Gene's butter pass technique, created multiple fusion zones stacked on top of each other. When impact occurred, the stress distributed across all the layers instead of concentrating in one spot. The result was a weld that could absorb far more punishment before failing. Additionally, Gene's preheating technique reduced thermal stress. Cold metal, when welded, contracts rapidly as the weld cools, creating internal stresses that weaken the joint. Preheated metal cools more slowly, more evenly, reducing those internal stresses. It was basic metallurgy. But in the rush to mass-produce Sherman tanks, those basics had been sacrificed for speed. Gene hadn't invented anything new. He'd just remembered what the steel industry had known for decades, and he'd been willing to break Army regulations to apply it. Eugene Kozlowski served until the end of the war. He was promoted to Master Sergeant, awarded the Bronze Star, and quietly credited with saving hundreds of tank crew lives. But he never stopped drinking, never became the sober, respectable soldier the Army wanted. He remained exactly what he'd always been, a rough, undisciplined mechanic from Pittsburgh who was brilliant with his hands and terrible at following rules. After the war, Gene went home. Back to the steel mills, back to welding. He never talked about what he'd done in Europe. When people asked, he'd say, "I fixed some tanks, that's all." He died in 1982, at the age of 66, from liver disease. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his military service, but not the welding technique. Most people never knew. But in the archives of the Army Ordnance Department, there's a technical bulletin, Field Modification Procedure 7B, Enhanced Welding Techniques for Armoured Vehicle Repair. And on page 1, in small print, it says, Developed by T.S. Jeet E.L. Kozlowski, 3rd Armoured Division, December 1944. Eugene Kozlowski never claimed to be a hero, never wrote a memoir, never stood at a podium and explained his innovations. He was just a drunk mechanic who refused to watch men die in tanks that could have been built better. But his story, the story of a man who broke every rule to save lives, carries a lesson that transcends warfare, transcends welding, transcends time. It's a lesson about expertise, about knowing the difference between credentials and competence, about listening to the people who actually do the work, not just the people with degrees and titles. In a world that worships official knowledge, that demands university education and professional certification, Gene's story reminds us that sometimes the best solutions come from the factory floor, not the engineering office. That sometimes the person who knows how to fix a problem isn't the one with the most impressive resume, it's the one with the most scarred hands. The Army didn't want to believe that a drunk mechanic knew more about welding than their engineers. It challenged their assumptions, their hierarchy, their pride. But the results spoke for themselves. 100% survival rate for Gene's tanks. 40% stronger welds. Hundreds of lives saved. And a technique that would influence armoured vehicle design for decades. But here's what makes Gene's story truly remarkable. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it to prove anyone wrong. He did it because he couldn't watch another Sherman burn, because he knew there was a better way, because he'd rather risk court-martial than live with knowing he could have saved someone and didn't try. So what about you? What broken system are you working within right now? What solution do you know would work, but you're not supposed to suggest because you're not high enough in the hierarchy, not credentialed enough, not official enough. How many times have you seen a better way and stayed silent because that's not how we do things, or that's above your pay grade, or let the experts handle it? Eugene Kozlowski didn't stay silent. He grabbed a welding torch and fixed what was broken, even though it meant disobeying orders, violating regulations, risking his career. Not because he was reckless, but because he understood something the army had forgotten. Regulations exist to serve a purpose. And when regulations stop serving that purpose, when they actually cost lives, following them becomes the wrong choice. Think about the tank crews he saved. Lieutenant Morrison and his men, who took 4 direct hits and walked away. Hundreds of other tankers who climbed into Shermans that didn't burn, that didn't crack, that kept them alive because a drunk mechanic from Pittsburgh had re-welded the armor with a technique the army said was illegal. Those men went home, had families, lived lives they shouldn't have lived, all because one person refused to accept that good enough was acceptable when better was possible. That's not just a welding story. That's a lesson about innovation, about courage, about the responsibility we have when we know something is wrong and have the ability to fix it. So here's my challenge to you. What's your illegal weld? What unapproved solution are you sitting on right now because you're afraid of breaking the rules? What lives, literal or metaphorical, could be saved if you were willing to risk the consequences of doing what you know is right instead of what you're told is proper? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Because maybe your solution is the next one that changes everything. Maybe somewhere, someone is dying because the official way doesn't work. And maybe they need someone like Eugene Kozlowski to say, I don't care if it's against regulations, I'm fixing this anyway. The world will always have rule followers, people who do exactly what they're told, who never colour outside the lines, who prioritise procedure over results. And sometimes that's appropriate. Rules exist for reasons, but the world also needs rule breakers. Not anarchists, not rebels without cause, but people like Gene, who understand when rules are helping and when they're hurting, who have the expertise to know better, and who have the courage to act on that knowledge even when authority tells them no. If this story changed how you think about expertise, about credentials, about who gets to innovate and who's supposed to just follow orders, share it, pass it on, because the world needs more Eugene Kozlowskis. More people who trust their hands more than the manual. More people who'd rather face consequences than watch something fail when they know how to fix it. More people willing to get drunk, grab a torch, and weld something that everyone says can't be welded. Not because they're trying to be heroes, but because they're trying to keep people alive. And sometimes, that's the only thing that matters. Thank you for watching.